In this tutorial, you will learn a couple of things. First, you'll learn about some key terminologies used in OAuth. These are terms you will encounter in OAuth implementations, in articles, pretty much anything to do with OAuth. Once you've learned those key terminologies, you will understand how some of the important OAuth flows work in detail. OAuth has a lot of different variety of flows, but there are like a few key ones that you really should be knowing, which you will by the end of this tutorial. Let's get started. Okay, let's start by looking at some terminologies. To set the context, we're going to be using this example hypothetical scenario where we have this photo printing service that a user is using, and the user wants to access some photos saved on the Google Drive in order to print it. So basically, we want one service, which is the photo printing service, to be able to access another service, which is the Google Drive service. This is the hypothetical situation. If you aren't really keeping up with the videos on the series, I highly recommend you check out the suggested video in the card here to get to the first part, which talks about this in a little more detail. Go watch that and then come back to this one. Okay, so this is the scenario. Now let's look at some of the terminologies that represent some of these key actors over here, all right? The first terminology that we're going to be covering is the resource. This is also referred to sometimes as the protected resource. We call a resource as something which is what is being sought by all the different actors in this OAuth space, all right, in this OAuth flow. So in this particular case, what is the thing that needs to be accessed? It is the photos on Google Drive, right? So that's the resource, all right? That's the protected resource. That's something that is protected and not everybody has access to it. The whole reason why we have this OAuth flow, why we are talking about this OAuth flow here, is to allow access to that resource, right? That's the first term, that's the resource. Now that you've understood resource, the second term should probably make sense as well. The resource owner. The resource owner is the person who has access to the resource right now, which is the user. It's the guy sitting on the laptop saying, hey, I have my photos on Google Drive and I want to print them, right? This is also the person who can grant access to that resource to the photo printing service, right? If you look at the OAuth spec, this is the definition of a resource owner in the OAuth spec. It is that entity that is capable of granting access to that protected resource. The photo printing service needs access to the resource. Guess who can give access? It is that resource owner. It's that person whose photos are on the Google Drive. Okay, that was terminology number 2. The terminology number 3 should also make sense. It is the resource server. Well, what is a resource server? It is the server that's holding the protected resource, right? It's that server that's hosting it. In this case, the Google Drive is the resource server, all right? So we have the resource server, we have the resource owner, and the resource itself is what is being protected and needs to be accessed. That leaves just one entity here, which is the photo printing service. What's it called? It has the unfortunate name of being called a client, all right? It's a little odd, but let me explain. So the client is that application which needs access to that protected resource, right? It's the application that's making requests to the protected resource on behalf of the resource owner and with the resource owner's authorization. Okay, the resource owner is basically saying, hey, client, get me the protected resource and do something with it, right? So that's the client. In this particular case, the user sitting in front of the laptop trying to print his picture is the resource owner. Google Drive is the resource server, and the photo printing service, which is trying to access the resource, is the client. There is one more role here which I want to mention, but before I talk about that, I have a question for you. In this whole thing, right? So there is somebody who's trying to access something, and there is someone else who's like, okay, I want to see if I trust you before I give you access, right? So this is the interaction that's happening here. So in this particular interaction, who has the burden of security? It's whose responsibility to make sure things are happening securely and there is no bad actor who's trying to access it and use it for malicious purposes. Well, who has the burden of security is the person who has the resource, right? The resource holder has their own best interests to make sure that the resource is secure, all right? So in this particular case, you have the photo printing service saying, I want to access the photo. And Google Drive has what that photo printing service needs. So it's Google Drive's responsibility to make sure we are providing the right authorization, okay? So typically, the resource server has coupled with it an authorization server. The authorization server is responsible for making sure whoever is accessing the resource server is authorized. Okay, so Google implements OAuth. So Google implements this authorization server, which takes care of the authorization. Its responsibility is to make sure authorization is happening fine. Okay, so resource server and authorization server are usually coupled. There is something called an authorization server when a resource server is implementing OAuth. This authorization server could be a separate server, or it could be along with the resource server. Those two could be one thing. The spec doesn't really cover a lot of detail about how these two should be separated and how they need to interact. But rest assured that you can think of all these different flows in terms of two things that take care of this, right? So one part of it is the authorization server. The other part of it is the resource server, which actually holds the resource. So we are at term number 5, which is the authorization server. So this is a server that issues access tokens to the client. Okay, we will talk about what access tokens are when we discuss flow, which is coming up right now. But basically, the authorization server's responsibility is to authorize, and the resource server's responsibility is to just manage and host the resource, right? Separation of concerns there. Okay, now that we have these different elements, these different actors, let's look at how a typical OAuth flow works. There are actually multiple variations of the OAuth flow. Like I said, there isn't one particular flow that is the right way and others are the wrong way. There are various ways we can do this. And there are actually various implementations of how these flows work that are out there on the internet. I'm going to be covering few really important flows. We're going to be tackling 3 important flows that you really need to know. All right, starting with OAuth flow number 1, the authorization code flow. Right, this is one of the 3 flows that we're going to be tackling. This is basically this exchange, this dance between all these different entities to make sure the user is able to connect the photo printing service to the actual Google Drive service so that they get the job done, right? So this is the dance between the resource owner, the client, and the resource server who works in conjunction with the authorization server. So this is how this works. I'm going to break it down into individual steps, and we'll look at how the flow works. The first step is the user has logged on to the photo printing service, and they say, hey, I want to print my photo, but that my photo is on Google Drive. So, hey, photo printing service, can you please go fetch my photos from Google Drive, right? So this is the resource owner telling the client, go access the resource in my resource server. So what does the client do? The client, the photo printing service, says, okay, I need to access this resource server. I know this guy. This guy doesn't get me access directly. This guy uses OAuth. So I know that there is an authorization server I need to talk to. First, let me go talk to this authorization server. And the photo printing service go to the authorization server and says, hey, it's me. My user wants to access a resource from your resource server, right? You can think of the Google Drive and authorization server, the resource server and the authorization server as one thing. So the client is saying, hey, I need access to this resource. The authorization server says, okay, my resource owner might have asked you to contact me, but then I cannot be sure. I cannot trust you. I just trust the person who has the Google account. I don't trust you, client. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go talk to that person, the actual resource owner, and see if they actually want you to do this, right? So they go to the resource owner and say, hey, resource owner, this guy, this client, this photo printing service wants to access your files. Are you cool with that? Do you want to do it? Okay. So what gets asked to the resource owner is not just who is making that access, but also these are all the things that this client wants to do. The client wants to access photos in this particular location. They want to download it, but they don't want to create new photos, right? So it's basically not just who is trying to get access, but also what are the permissions that they need. Okay, so the authorization server goes to the resource owner and says, hey, are you cool with this? Do you want me to allow them? And then the resource owner says, okay, I'm actually the person who asked that client to access the resource. So go ahead, allow them. It's all cool. Now the authorization server says, now I have confirmation from the resource owner. Now I can give you, client, access to the resource. So what it does is it sends the client an authorization token. Okay, it's a short-lived authorization token that goes to the client. Now the client uses this authorization token and contacts the authorization server to get a second token, which is the access token. Okay, so there is a couple of exchanges that happens here, right? When the authorization server gets confirmation from the resource owner, it says, okay, I'm going to give the client, the photo printing service, an authorization token. Now the photo printing service / client sends the authorization token back to the authorization server and says, yes, this is actually me. Can you please give me an access token? The authorization server says, okay, now we have done both sides of exchange. Now I fully trust you and I give you this access token. Go ahead and use this access token to contact the resource server and access the resource. Okay, an access token is kind of like a key which the client, the photo printing service, can hold on to. The typical analogy that's given is like a room card when you check into a hotel. Okay, you go to the reception desk in a hotel, you booked a hotel room, you go to the reception desk and you say, hey, it's me, I made the payment, can I access my room? Now the receptionist gives you the room key and they say, okay, this is the room key for this particular room. This is your access token for that room. Anytime you want to access that room, just use this key. That's this access token. The authorization server gives the key to the resource on the resource server to the client. Now the client holds on to that key, holds on to the access token, and whenever they want to access the resource, whenever the photo printing service wants to access the photo, it calls the resource server directly with the token, with the key. It says, hey Google Drive, here's my access token. This access token proves that I have access to this particular user's files. So give me the file. Now Google Drive says, okay, now I'm the resource server. I've got this access token. Let me verify with the authorization server if it's true, if it's correct and all that stuff. It makes sure that the token is valid. It can do whatever it wants to make sure that the token is valid. It can validate it itself, or it can talk to the authorization server and validate it. Whatever it is, it figures out that this is a valid token, and then it provides the resource to the client. So the Google Drive service, the resource service, provides the resource, the photos, to the photo printing service, and the photo printing service can finally print. All right, this is flow number 1. This involves the authorization token, and this is the best and the safest flow possible, in my opinion, for OAuth. You do this when you have services that you can trust and you want maximum security. All right, this is flow number 1. Flow number 2 is something called implicit flow. This works very similar to flow number 1, but it's a little bit simplified. Okay, here's how this works. This flow starts out the same way. You have the resource owner making a request to the client, the photo printing app here, and saying, hey, I need to print photos on my Google Drive. Again, the photo printing app calls the authorization server and say, hey, can you authorize me? Again, step 2 is same as before. The authorization server goes to the resource owner and says, hey, this guy wants to access me. Should I allow it? Again, same as before. Step 4 is again same as before. The resource owner says, yes, I initiated that action. go ahead and authorize. Now, step 5 is where things are different. Rather than the authorization server hand over an authorization token and have the client exchange it back to get the access token, this time the authorization server sends the access token directly. It just says, well, here you go. Here's your access token. Go ahead and use it. And now the client makes a call to the resource server with that access token, right? It's the room key. It uses the access token to access the resource, and then the resource server hands back the resource. All right. This is a slightly simplified flow when compared to flow number 1. There is no exchange of authorization key with the access key. All right. So this is the implicit flow. This comes with a drawback though. What is a drawback? The photo printing application has the access token, and it's using that access token anytime it wants to contact the resource server. Now, the only thing that's needed to access the resource server is that access token. Imagine someone else gets access to the access token. Well, then they can impersonate as this particular service and access the Google Drive. Imagine you lose your hotel key, someone else gets it, and they know exactly what room and what hotel that key belongs to. They can get into your hotel room, right? It's just that key, it's just the access token. Anybody who has the access token can access the resource, all right? This is the reason why this is a little bit less secure. Now, if you're wondering, how does the first flow solve this problem? Wouldn't that still have the access token? Well, there are ways in which you can handle how the access token gets exchanged, right? The way the client passes the authorization token to get the access token is something that can be secured. So the access token can be much more securely exchanged in the first flow as opposed to the second flow. All right. So this is useful. The second flow is useful only with certain kinds of applications, specifically JavaScript applications where the access token is not really something you would assume is secure. When you have a JavaScript application that's running on the client, and that's what's actually making this request to the authorization server and to the resource server, well, you know that the access token is going to be exchanged over the wire and it's going to sit in the browser. So it is not very secure to begin with. Okay, so that's the reason why you use the second flow, which is a slightly simplified flow, a slightly less secure flow for those kind of scenarios where you cannot have the secure exchange for the authorization token. Okay, so the implicit flow is not very secure, which is why the access tokens that's exchanged in this particular flow is short-lived. And like I said, it's primarily used for JavaScript apps, which is basically JavaScript running on a browser, which is triggering this whole flow. Okay, we're going to move on to the final flow we're going to talk about in this tutorial. This is the big use case. Let me see if you can guess what this is. OAuth, we talked about, is for authorization between services. Okay, two services who are trying to talk to each other and you want to authorize it. Now, what is a good application of OAuth for talking between services? Let me give you a clue. Let me zoom into the key couple of words here. Between services. Well, you might have guessed it by now. It's authorization between microservices. What are microservices if not two services trying to talk to each other, right? And you want to authorize them. Well, OAuth is perfect for authorization between microservices. I'm going to talk to you about a flow which is useful in the context of microservices. I'm not going to get into the details of how the authentication and the authorization works, but there is a specific authorization scenario where OAuth works really well. And there is a specific flow in the OAuth spec for this particular thing. And it is called the client credentials flow. This flow is used when the client is super duper trustworthy, right? You're the application architect and you know that the client is trustworthy. One example of a trustworthy client is if you are writing the client yourself, right? Which is exactly what a microservice situation is. Imagine you have two microservices. Microservice 1 wants to call an API in microservice 2, okay? And it's trying to maybe access a database. Microservice 2 has access to a database, microservice 1 tries to call an API in microservice 2, which leverages data in the database. If microservice 1 is calling microservice 2, it has access to only certain APIs, and it should not be ideally accessing some other APIs and some other data. All right, so you need to authorize it. So let's say there is this auth server sitting with microservice 2. Again, microservice 2 has this burden of security. So it has to make sure that whoever is accessing it can only get the data that they need and not get access to the whole database. So microservice 1 wants to call an API in microservice 2. Here's what it does. It first makes a call to the auth server, all right, the authentication server, and it provides a certain special key, a certain special client ID or something which says, hey, I am this particular microservice. Okay, let's say you're building a employee management system, all right? These are all microservices for employee management. And microservice 1 has user information, okay, public user information. That's what microservice 1 serves. And microservice 1 obviously should not be accessing the payroll information that could be accessible from microservice 2, for example. All right, microservice 1 has no business accessing payroll. It only has access to username and department and all those public information. So the auth server says, okay, I know who you are. I'm going to give you an access token, and this access token can be used for the kind of information that you need, which is profile information. Okay, the microservice 1 holds on to it, and then it makes a call to microservice 2 and say, hey, give me profile information. Microservice 2 goes and says, okay, your access allows profile information, so I'm going to serve you that. If microservice 1 were to say, hey, give me payroll information, microservice 2 is going to go and say, hey, your access token does not allow payroll information, so I'm not going to allow you. So this is the third OAuth flow, which works very well in the context of authorizing microservices. You have multiple microservices that are talking to each other. You don't want any microservice to be able to access any API in any other microservice. You want it to be restricted. And this particular OAuth flow is perfect for that. All right, so we've looked at a bunch of terminologies and 3 different OAuth flows. I should let you know that there is another OAuth flow which is not really a part of the spec, but you do see it in a lot of different places. And I want to cover both the good and the bad about it. You remember I talked about how OAuth is used for authorization and not for authentication. You don't use OAuth for authentication. You should be using it only for authorization. But then you might have also seen certain websites which have a sign up with Google, sign up with Facebook buttons. You're basically creating an account. You're signing in or signing up with Google or Facebook or any of those other identity providers. How can a website say log in with Facebook or sign up with Facebook when OAuth is not meant for authentication at all? Well, there is a story behind it, and I will cover that in this next tutorial, so check it out.